Political Economy by Frederick Bastiat. This is an excerpt from Chapter 1 of Harmonies of Political Economy, published 1850. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1, entitled Natural and Artificial Organization. It is quite certain that the mechanism of society, like the mechanism of the heavenly bodies or that of the human frame, is subject to general laws. Does it form a harmonious, organized whole, or rather do we not remark in it the absence of all organization? Is not an organization the very thing which all men of the heart and of the future, all advanced publicists, all the pioneers of thought, are in search of at the present day? Is society anything else than a multitude of individuals placed in juxtaposition, acting without concert, and given up to the movements of an anarchical liberty? Are our countless masses, after having with difficulty recovered their liberties, one after the other, not now awaiting the advent of some great genius to arrange them into a harmonious whole? Having pulled down all, must we not now set about laying the foundation of a new edifice? And yet it may be asked, have these questions any other meaning than this? Can society dispense with written laws, rules, and repressive measures? Is every man to make an unlimited use of his faculties, even when in doing so he strikes at the liberties of another, or inflicts injury on society at large? In a word, must we recognize in the maxim laissez-faire, laissez-passer the absolute formula of political economy? If that were the question, no one could hesitate about the solution. The economists do not say that a man may kill, sack, burn, and that society has only to be quiescent, laissez-faire. They say that even in the absence of all law, society would resist such acts, and that consequently such resistance is a general law of humanity. They say that civil and penal laws must regulate and not counteract those general laws, the existence of which they presuppose. There is a wide difference between a social organization, founded on the general laws of human nature, and an artificial organization, invented, imagined, which takes no account of these laws, or repudiates and despises them, such as organization, in short, as many modern schools would impose upon us. For if there be general laws which act independently of written laws, and of which the latter can only regulate the action, we must study these general laws. They can be made the object of a science, and political economy exists. If, on the other hand, society is a human invention, if men are regarded only as inert matter to which a great genius like Rousseau must impart sentiment and will, movement and life, then there is no such science as political economy. There are only an infinite number of possible and contingent arrangements, and the fate of nations must depend upon the founder to whom chance shall have committed their destinies. In order to prove that society is subject to general laws, no elaborate dissertation is necessary. All I shall do is to notice certain facts which, although trite, are not the less important. Rousseau has said, Il fait beaucoup de philosophie pour observer les faits qui sont trop près de nous. Quote, much philosophy is needed to observe accurately things which are too near us. End quote. And such are the social phenomena in the midst of which we live and move. Habit has so familiarized us with these phenomena that we cease to observe them, unless something striking and exceptional forces them on our attention. Let us take by way of illustration a man in the humble walks of life, a village carpenter, for instance, and observe the various services he renders to society and receives from it. We shall not fail to be struck with the enormous disproportion which is apparent. The man employs his day's labor in planing boards and making tables and chests of drawers. He complains of his condition, yet in truth what does he receive from society in exchange for his work? First of all, on getting up in the morning, he dresses himself, and he has himself personally made none of the numerous articles of which his clothing consists. Now, in order to put at his disposal this clothing, simple as it is, an enormous amount of labor, industry, and locomotion, and many ingenious inventions must have been employed. Americans must have produced cotton, Indians indigo, Frenchmen wool and flax, Brazilians hides, and all these materials must have been transported to various towns where they have been worked up, spun, woven, dyed, etc. Then he breakfasts. In order to procure him the bread which he eats every morning, land must have been cleared, enclosed, labored, manured, sown. The fruits of the soil must have been preserved with care from pillage, and security must have reigned among an innumerable multitude of people. The wheat must have been cut down, ground into flour, kneaded, and prepared. Iron, steel, wood, stone must have been converted by industry into instruments of labor. Some men must have employed animal force, others water power, etc., all matters of which each, taken singly, presupposes a mass of labor, whether we have regard to space or time, of incalculable amount. In the course of the day, this man will have occasion to use sugar, oil, and various other materials and utensils. He sends his son to school, there to receive an education, which, although limited, nevertheless implies anterior study and research, and an extent of knowledge which startles the imagination. He goes out, he finds the street paved and lighted. A neighbor goes to law with him. He finds advocates to please his cause, judges to maintain his rights, officers of justice to put the sentence in execution, all which implies acquired knowledge, and consequently intelligence and means of subsistence. He goes to church. It is a stupendous monument, and the book which he carries thither is a monument perhaps still more stupendous of human intelligence. He is taught morals, he has his mind enlightened, his soul elevated, and in order to this we must suppose that another man had previously frequented schools and libraries, consulted all the sources of human learning, and while so employed had been able to live without occupying himself directly with the wants of the body. If our artisan undertakes a journey, he finds out, in order to save him time and exertion, other men have removed and leveled the soil, filled up valleys, hewed down mountains, united the banks of rivers, diminished friction, placed wheeled carriages on blocks of sandstone or bands of iron, and brought the force of animals and the power of steam into subjection to human wants. It is impossible not to be struck with the measureless disproportion which exists between the enjoyments which this man derives from society and what he could obtain by his own unassisted exertions. I venture to say that in a single day he consumes more than he could himself produce in 10 centuries. What renders the phenomenon still more strange is that all other men are in the same situation. Every individual member of society has absorbed millions of times more than he could himself produce, yet there is no mutual robbery. And if we regard things more nearly, we perceive that the carpenter has paid in services for all the services which others have rendered to him. If we bring the matter to a strict reckoning, we shall be convinced that he has received nothing which he has not paid for by means of his modest industry, and that every one who, at whatever interval of time or space, has been employed in his service, has received or will receive his remuneration. The social mechanism, then, must be very ingenious and very powerful, since it leads to this singular result, that each man, even he whose lot is cast in the humblest condition, has more enjoyment in one day than he could himself produce in many ages. Nor is this all. The mechanism of society will appear still more ingenious if the reader will be pleased to turn his regards upon himself. I suppose him a plain student. What is his business in Paris? How does he live? It cannot be disputed that society places at his disposal food, clothing, lodging, amusements, books, means of instruction, a multitude of things, in short, which would take a long time not only to produce, but even to explain how they were produced. And what services has this student rendered to society in return for all these things which have exacted so much labor, toil, fatigue, physical and intellectual effort, so many inventions, transactions, and conveyances hither and thither? Why, none at all. He is only preparing to render services. Why, then, have so many millions of men abandoned to him the fruits of their positive, effective, and productive labor? Here is the explanation. The father of this student, who was a lawyer perhaps, or a physician, or a merchant, had formerly rendered services, it may be to society in China, and had been remunerated, not by immediate services, but by a title to demand services at any time, in the place and under the form that might be most suitable and convenient to him. It is of these past and distant services that society is now acquitting itself, and astonishing as it seems, if we follow in thought the infinite range of transactions which must have had place in order to this result being effected, we shall see that every one has been remunerated for his labor and services, and that these titles have passed from hand to hand, sometimes divided into parts, sometimes grouped together, until in the consumption of this student the entire account has been squared and balanced. Is not this a very remarkable phenomenon? We should shut our eyes to the light of day did we fail to perceive that society could not present combinations so complicated, and in which civil and penal laws have so little part, unless it obeyed the laws of a mechanism wonderfully ingenious. The study of that mechanism is the business of political economy. End of Political Economy by Frederick Bastiat. Recorded by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in October 2018. In W.H. Hudson's novel, The Purple Land, being the narrative of one Richard Lamb's adventures in the Banda Oriental in South America, as told by himself, published in 1904, an Englishman wandering on horseback through 19th century Uruguay finds adventure and romance in that war-ravaged country. The end of Chapter 18 contains this excerpt, summing up Hudson's opinions on the effects of British colonization. It is not an exclusively British characteristic to regard the people of other nationalities with a certain amount of contempt, but with us, perhaps, the feeling is stronger than with others, or else expressed with less reserve. Let me now at last rid myself of this error, which is harmless and perhaps even commendable in those who stay at home, and also very natural, since it is a part of our unreasonable nature to distrust and dislike the things that are far removed and unfamiliar. Let me at last divest myself of these old English spectacles, framed in oak and with lenses of horn, to bury them forever in this mountain, for which half a century and upwards has looked down on the struggles of a young and feeble people against foreign aggression and domestic foes, and where a few months ago I sang the praises of British civilization, lamenting that it had been planted here and abundantly watered with blood, only to be plucked up again and cast into the sea. After my rambles in the interior, where I carried about in me only a fading remnant of that old time-honored superstition to prevent the most perfect sympathy between me and the natives I mixed with, I cannot say that I am of that opinion now. I cannot believe that if this country had been conquered and recolonized by England, and all that is crooked in it made straight according to our notions, my intercourse with the people would have had this wild, delightful flavor I have found in it. And if that distinctive flavor cannot be had along with the material prosperity resulting from Anglo-Saxon energy, I must breathe the wish that this land may never know such prosperity. I do not wish to be murdered, no man does, yet rather than see the ostrich and deer chased beyond the horizon, the flamenco and black-necked swan slain on the blue lakes, and the herdsman sent to twang his romantic guitar in Hades as a preliminary to security of person, I would prefer to go about prepared at any moment to defend my life against the sudden assaults of the assassin. We do not live by bread alone, and British occupation does not give to the heart all the things for which it craves. Blessings may even become curses when the gigantic power that bestows them on us scares from our midst the shy spirits of beauty and of poesy. Nor is it solely because it appeals to the poetic feeling in us that this country endears itself to my heart. It is the perfect republic. The sense of emancipation experienced in it by the wanderer from the old world is indescribably sweet and novel. Even in our ultra-civilized condition at home, we do periodically escape back to nature, and breathing the fresh mountain air and gazing over vast expanses of ocean and land, we find that she is still very much to us. It is something more than these bodily sensations we experience when first mingling with our fellow creatures, where all men are absolutely free and equal, as here. I fancy I hear some wise person exclaiming, "No, no, no. In name only is your purple land a republic. Its constitution is a piece of waste paper, its government an oligarchy tempered by assassination and revolution." True. But the knot of ambitious rulers, all striving to pluck each other down, have no power to make the people miserable. The unwritten Constitution, mightier than the written one, is in the heart of every man to make him still a Republican, and free with a freedom it would be hard to match anywhere else on the globe. The Bedouin himself is not so free, since he accords an almost superstitious reverence and implicit obedience to his sheik. Here the lord of many leagues of land and of herds unnumbered sits down to talk with the hired shepherd, a poor barefooted fellow in his smoky rancho, and no class or caste difference divides them, no consciousness of their widely different positions chills the warm current of sympathy between two human hearts. How refreshing it is to meet with this perfect freedom of intercourse, tempered only by that innate curiosity and native grace of manner peculiar to Spanish Americans. What a change to a person coming from lands with higher and lower classes, each with its innumerable hateful subdivisions, to one who aspires not to mingle with the class above him, yet who shudders at the slouching carriage and abject demeanor of the class beneath him. If this absolute equality is inconsistent with perfect political order, I for one should grieve to see such order established. Moreover, it is by no means true that the communities which oftenest startle us with crimes of disorder and violence are morally worse than others. A community in which there are not many crimes cannot be morally healthy. There were practically no crimes in Peru under the Inca dynasty. It was a marvelous thing for a person to commit an offense in that empire. And the reason for this most unnatural state of things was this. The Inca system of government was founded on that most iniquitous and disastrous doctrine that the individual bears the same relation to the state as a child to its parents, that its life from the cradle to the grave must be regulated for it by a power it is taught to regard as omniscient, a power practically omnipresent and almighty. In such a state there could be no individual will, no healthy play of passions, and consequently no crime. What wonder that a system so unspeakably repugnant to a being who feels that his will is a divinity working within him fell to pieces at the first touch of foreign invasion, or that it left no vestige of its pernicious existence on the continent it had ruled. For the whole state was, so to speak, putrid even before dissolution, and when it fell it mingled with the dust and was forgotten. Poland, before its conquest by Russia, a country ill-governed and disorderly as the Banda Orientale, did not mingle with dust like that when it fell. The implacable despotism of the Tsar was unable to crush its fierce spirit. Its will still survived to gild dreary oppression with hallowed dreams, to make it clutch with a fearful joy the dagger concealed in its bosom. But I had no need to go away from this green continent to illustrate the truth of what I have said. People who talk and write about the disorderly South American republics are fond of pointing to Brazil, that great, peaceful, progressive empire, as setting an example to be followed. An orderly country, yes, and the people in it steeped to their lips in every abominable vice. Compared with these emasculated children of the equator, the Orientals are nature's noblemen. I can very well imagine some over-righteous person saying, "Alas, poor deluded soul, how little importance can we attach to your specious apologies of a people's lawlessness, when your own personal narrative shows that the moral atmosphere you have been breathing has quite corrupted you. Go back over your own record, and you will find that you have, according to our notions, offended in various ways and on divers occasions, and that you are even without the grace to repent of all the evil things you have thought, said, and done." I have not read many books of philosophy, because when I tried to be a philosopher, happiness was always breaking in, as someone says. Also because I have loved to study men rather than books, and in the little I have read there occurs a passage I remember well, and this I shall quote as my answer to anyone who may call me an immoral person, because my passions have not always remained in a quiescent state, like hounds, to quote a simile of a South American poet, slumbering at the feet of the huntsman resting against a rock at noon. We should regard the perturbations of the mind, says Spinoza, not in the light of vices of human nature, but as properties just as pertinent to it as are heat, storms, thunder, and the like, to the nature of the atmosphere, which phenomena, though inconvenient, are yet necessary, and have fixed causes by means of which we endeavor to understand their nature, and the mind has just as much pleasure in seeing them aright as in knowing such things as flatter the senses. Let me have the phenomenon which are inconvenient as well as the things which flatter the senses, and the chances are that my life will be a healthier and happier one than that of the person who spends his time on a cloud blushing at nature's naughtiness. It is often said that an ideal state, a utopia where there is no folly, crime, or sorrow, has a singular fascination for the mind. Now, when I meet with a falsehood, I care not who the great persons who proclaim it may be. I do not try to like it, or believe it, or mimic the fashionable prattle of the world about it. I hate all dreams of perpetual peace, all wonderful cities of the sun, where people consume their joyful, monotonous years in mystic contemplations, or find their delight, like Buddhist monks, in gazing on the ashes of dead generations of devotees. The state is one unnatural, unspeakably repugnant. The dreamless sleep of the grave is more tolerable to the active, healthy mind than such an existence. If Signor Gaudencio de Lucha, still keeping himself alive by means of his marvelous knowledge of the secrets of nature, were to appear before me now on this mountain to inform me that the sacred community he resided with in Central Africa was no mere dream, and should offer to conduct me to it, I should decline to go with him. I should prefer to remain in the Banda Oriental, even though by doing so I should grow at last to be as bad as any person in it, and ready to wade through slaughter to the presidential chair. For even in my own country of England, which is not so perfect as old Peru or the Paphar's country in Central Africa, I have been long divided from nature, and now in this Oriental country, whose political misdeeds are a scandal alike to pure England and impure Brazil, I have been reunited to her. For this reason I love her with all her faults. Here, like Santa Coloma, I will kneel down and kiss this stone, as an infant might kiss the breast that feeds it. Here, fearless of dirt, like John Carrickfergus, I will thrust my hands into the loose brown soil, to clasp the hands, as it were, of dear Mother Nature, after our long separation. Farewell, beautiful land of sunshine and storm, of virtue and of crime. May the invaders of the future fare on your soil like those of the past, and leave you in the end to your own devices. May the chivalrous instinct of Santa Coloma, the passion of Dolores, the loving kindness of Candelaria, still live in your children to brighten their lives with romance and beauty. May the blight of our superior civilization never fall on your wild flowers, or the yoke of our progress be lain on your herdsmen, careless, graceful, music-loving as the birds, to make him like the sullen, abject peasant of the old world. End of excerpt from The Purple Land by W.H. Hudson.
A Raccoon Family's Night of Nights by Nellie M. Pearpoint, from St. Nicholas, an illustrated magazine for young folks, Volume 43, Part 2, 1916. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Father Raccoon came shuffling through the woods from his night's hunting, sitting bolt upright at every few steps to survey his surroundings like his near relative the bear, then coming a few steps further until his attention was attracted by a twig which his facile paws caught and turned as dexterously as could human hands, while he smelled it with the closest attention, seeming to gain some news of the wood world by touch and scent. As he reached the foot of his home tree, the elusive opalescent light of dawn changed to a golden gleam here and there, and the first of the ever-busy wild bees buzzed along over his head. He paused as they went by, then looked back along the way he had come, as though their familiar humming had reminded him of the scent of honey that he had noticed from a hollow branch as he came home. But it had been too light to investigate then, as the bees were stirring. But what raccoon can resist honey? It seemed as if he were laying future plans as he sat at the foot of the hemlock tree, with his front paws resting on the trunk, looking back with his wise, deep-set little eyes twinkling and gleaming as he thought it out. Then he started to climb the tree. The bird's morning hymn of praise increased to its fullest volume, and the first of the red squirrels came chattering through the tree-tops. The daylight life of the woods awoke at the first ray of sunlight, just as the night life of the forest was yawning and drowsy for its day's sleep. Squirrel paused a moment as he watched Raccoon ponderously climbing the tree trunk, to hurl spiteful chatterings at him, before following the interlacing branches that formed the overhead highway to the drinking place at the edge of the pool. Raccoon was not interested, and beyond one careful, steady look, continued on his way to the top of the tree. Once he paused opposite the hole in the trunk that held his nest, and several shrill squeals welcomed him on his return home. Feeling assured that all was well, he continued on his way to the top of the tree, where the small branches sprang out on all sides, making a row of radiating spokes around the central stem. This was the spot he was seeking, and after a preliminary inspection and some arrangement of his toilet, he settled himself on his spring bed of boughs for his day's sleep. His body quite surrounded the central stem. The branches and bunches of foliage hid him completely from the ground, and it needed sharp eyes to distinguish his striped fur even when close to him. The robins and blackbirds flocked through the woods, attending to their daily affairs, settling within a few feet of the sleeping raccoon, and never seeing him, until an active, bustling bluejay, the policeman of the woods, joined them. Hardly had he alighted before he set up a shrill hubbub that aroused every feathered denizen of the woods, and Raccoon as well. From experience he knew there would be no further peace after Bluejay had found him. So while they were all flying around his sleeping place, shrieking and protesting, he scrambled down the tree trunk and into his hole to finish his day's sleep in the midst of his family. And after a time the birds departed about their own affairs. As the day passed and twilight came, the night life of the woods again awoke, and the day life became quiet. As the moon rose, the young raccoons came out of their nest hole and played and wrestled on the branch beside it. Their father and mother came down the tree trunk, and the young ones soon followed. When they reached the ground, after a careful scrutiny of the surrounding objects, the party started off through the woods. They shuffled along, nosing everything that came their way, and with restless paws, feeling everything within reach. Their progress through the woods was deliberate, but continued so steadily that they covered a long distance before dawn. They followed the paths through the undergrowth that were common highways to the wood folk, until they came to the pond, where they paused and dabbled their paws in the mud and water for the pure joy of dabbling. An unfortunate frog that ventured too near was promptly caught by Mother Raccoon, while the babies gathered a spray of low-growing blackberries and washed them in the water until the berries were battered out of shape with much handling. They were then approved by their mother's superior knowledge as being fit to eat. But Father Raccoon was calling with low, insistent whines, for this was not the main business of the night. This was to be a night of nights, one of the feast nights of the whole summer, and time must not be wasted on frogs and blackberries and the pleasures of mud and water. The party once more got under way and traveled along the edge of the pond until they came to the cornfield. The corn was in ideal condition, tender and milky, and they fell to work with a will. They tore the ears down and trampled the stalks, destroying more than they could eat. But when they raided the cornfield, they did it well, for it was unwise to come often, as the farmer did not welcome their visits. When an ear was torn from the stalk and stripped of its husks, it was carried down to the pond and washed. It was plunged into the water and trampled upon, and turned over with those ever restless paws, until it appeared to be covered with mud. But then it seemed to them to be in the most desirable condition. They ate and grunted and whined with satisfaction as they dabbled in the water and devoured the much-washed corn, until the night was far advanced and the end of the cornfield a wreck. Then it was time for their homeward journey. Father Raccoon, who being of a shrewd and calculating turn of mind, knew that it was prudent to return by a different path, led the way to the first oak tree beyond the pond, where the outstretching branches formed a tapestry against the sky, and interlaced with other branches until a continuous highway was made in the middle of the forest. He led the way, the others following, stepping in his tracks where it was possible, pausing to sniff at the same leaf or twig that he did, and watching shrewdly any movement that might suggest the presence of an unwary moth or beetle that might be captured. A still, chill movement of the air floated through the tree-tops, telling of the coming dawn, and the night folk realized that their time of work and play was drawing to an end, while a sleepy chirp from a bird told that it, too, half realized that day was almost come. Suddenly Father Raccoon paused, an alert nose in the air warning the line following him that something new was there. He seemed to hear the hum of bees as a faint scent of honey reached him, and he remembered his plans of the morning. Again it was a little late, for the first white light was creeping up the eastern sky, and although his fur was long and thick, bees that could find their way to fly could also find his nose and ears and eyes to sting, and would not simply cling and hum in their hive as they would do in the dark. But the young raccoons had scented honey by this time, and their whines and excitement banished his last doubts. He branched away from the highway in the air to investigate a hollow branch a little above. Just as Father Raccoon reached the hollow, a shrill chatter from the end of the branch announced the awakening of Red Squirrel in his summer home, and he promptly sounded the alarm that the raccoon family were still abroad, although past their time. After a prolonged and careful look at Red Squirrel, Father Raccoon dipped a cautious paw into the hole and pulled out a piece of honey-laden comb, which he dropped down for the other members of the family to devour. They lost no time in reaching the ground to secure that choice morsel. A moment later the air was full of irate bees, humming, buzzing, darting this way and that, ready to sting any and everything within reach in defense of their honey. Father Raccoon's ears and eyes and nose were within the bees' reach, and apparently Red Squirrel was doing all in his power to urge them on. 1, 2, or more pieces of honeycomb came out as the result of the energetic thrusts of that facile paw, when the bees got too thick and he had to beat a retreat toward the ground. Red Squirrel followed, chattering, scolding, dancing from side to side, when a violent barking made Father Raccoon's heart stand still. A sharp cry of warning from him came just as 2 of the dogs from the farm broke through the underbrush and almost upon the mother and the young raccoons, who were intent on the honey. Father Raccoon's wits were alert, and with his loudest whines he noisily scrambled down the tree trunk to within a few feet of the ground, until the dog's attention was gained, and both rushed at the tree, leaping into the air in frantic excitement. But Father Raccoon kept just out of their reach, although he appeared too much startled to get away. Up and down he shuffled, still out of reach, but so near that the dogs were sure they could get him at the next jump. As they leaped and barked, they attracted the attention of the bees, so the angry insects deserted the raccoon, who was comparatively still, to attack the dogs, who were not. With frantic yelps both dogs rushed through the woods to the farm, with the bees following. As the dogs' cries died away in the distance, Raccoon scrambled to the ground and rushed through the bushes to the next tree with whines and squeals to call his family together. When he reached the upper branches, there they all were, each having come up a separate tree, and together they found the highway overhead. But Father Raccoon had no mind to return to the home nest, where the farmer and his dogs might look for them, but turned off at right angles to the accustomed highway. They disappeared with surprising rapidity, and the forest swallowed them up on their way to a new home. For the rest of that season the red squirrel and the blue jay could find no raccoons in the woods. End of A Raccoon Family's Night of Nights by Nellie M. Pearpoint. From St. Nicholas, an Illustrated Magazine for Young Folks, Volume 43, Part 2, 1916. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
Rational Psychology by Christian von Wolff, 1679 to 1754. Translated from the Latin by Edward Kennard Rand. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Essence and Nature of the Soul. The soul is a simple substance, for the soul is not body, nor can attribute communicated to the body. And further, neither is it a composite entity, nor does it inhere in a composite entity. Wherefore, since every entity is either composite or simple, the soul must be a simple entity. Now, since acts of thought continually change and succeed one another in turn, they are to be classed with modes. The soul, therefore, to which these modes apply, is subject to modification. And since it is obvious that the soul lasts for some time in conjunction with the body (for whether it can exist apart from the body or not need not be established here. It is perdurable. Certainly a perdurable and modifiable object is a substance. Therefore, the soul is a substance. But the soul is a simple entity by the foregoing proof. Therefore, it is a simple substance. The soul is endowed with a certain power. The soul is a substance, and since perceptions succeed one another in the same, and desires spring from perceptions, and perceptions again from desires, it is generally admitted in empirical psychology its condition changes. It therefore is endowed with a certain power. A power and a faculty of the soul are different from one another, for power consists in the continual endeavor to act. Faculties are merely potencies of action on the part of the soul, and thus have possibilities of action. Therefore a power of the soul and a faculty differ from one another. The soul continually tends to change its conditions, for it is endowed with a certain power. Wherefore, since a power continually tends to change the condition of the subject in which it is, the soul too, through the mediation of its own power, is bound to tend continually to change its condition. The power of the soul is absolutely simple, for the soul is simple and thus lacks parts. Let us now suppose that the soul has more than one power distinct from one another. Since every one of them consists in the continued endeavor to act, each one requires a particular subject in which it is. And so we must conceive of several actual entities distinct from one another, which when taken together with the soul will be parts of the same. But this is altogether absurd by the proof above given. The soul represents to itself this universe in accordance with the location of its organic body in the universe, conformably to the mutations which affect the organs of sensation. For this law of sensation is constant and inviolable. If a certain mutation is produced in some organ of sensation by some sensible object, there exists in the soul a sensation which may be explained to it in an intelligible way, or which recognizes in it a sufficient reason why it should be, and why it should be such as it is. Now sensations are perceptions of external objects, which produce a change in the organs of sensation. And hence, while the soul feels, it represents those objects to itself. And since our body is constantly in this visible world, bodies also which compose the same act constantly upon our body in accordance with its location in the world, or the universe. It is clear, therefore, that the soul represents to itself this universe, or this visible world, in accordance with the location of our organic body in the universe, and conformably to the mutations which the bodies of which it is composed produce in the same. When we sleep, we perceive nothing clearly and distinctly. However, since the soul is still in a condition of perception, although all its conceptions are confused or obscure, there is nothing to prevent it from still perceiving obscurely its own body and the things which impress it, and hence from continuing this representation of the world, so that therein it may be said without reservation that it represents to itself this universe. The essence of the soul consists in its power of representing, vis representiva, the universe, which power is materially limited by its location in an organic body in the universe, and formally limited by the constitution of the sensory organs. For this power is the first principle which is conceived with regard to the soul, and on which depend the other attributes which are inherent in it. Therefore, the essence of the soul consists in the same. The nature of the soul consists in the same representing power, vis representiva. For by this power of the soul, everything is activated that is possible through the faculties of the soul. Wherefore, since we understand by the nature of the soul that principle of mutations in the soul which is intrinsic in the same, just as by the nature of the universe we understand that principle of mutations in the world which is intrinsic in the same, and since this principle of mutation is power, and since the power with which the soul is endowed is only the power of representing, viz. Representiva, the universe, that power of representing, viz. Representiva, the universe, is likewise the nature of the soul. End of Rational Psychology by Christian von Wolff, 1679 to 1754. Translated from the Latin by Edward Kennard Rand.
San Francisco during the eventful days of April 1906. Personal Recollections by James B. Stetson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. These recollections were written in June 1906, but the first edition being exhausted and a new one being required, I have included some events that occurred later, without changing the original date. As the earthquake and the Great Fire in San Francisco in the year 1906 were events of such unusual interest, and realizing how faulty is man's memory after time passes, I have here jotted down a few incidents which I personally observed, and shall lay them away, so that if in the future I should desire, I can refer to these notes, made while the events were new and fresh in my mind, with some assurance of their accuracy. On the morning of April 18th, 1906, at 5:13, in my residence, 1801 Van Ness Avenue, I was awakened by a very severe shock of earthquake. The shaking was so violent that it nearly threw me out of bed. It threw down a large bookcase in my chamber, broke the glass front, and smashed 2 chairs. Another bookcase fell across the floor. The chandelier was so violently shaken that I thought it would be broken into pieces. The bric-a-brac was thrown from the mantel and tables, and strewed the floor with broken china and glass. It is said to have lasted 58 seconds, but as nearly as I can estimate, the violent part was only about 12 seconds. As soon as it was over, I got up and went to the window, and saw the air in the street filled with a white dust, which was caused by the falling of masonry from St. Luke's Church, on the diagonal corner from my room. I waited for the dust to settle, and then I saw the damage which had been done to Klaus Spreckels' house and the church. The chimneys of the Spreckels mansion were gone, the stone balustrade and carved work wrecked. The roof and the points of the gables and ornamental stonework of the church had fallen, covering the sidewalk and lying piled up against the sides of the building to the depth of 8 or 10 feet. About this time Rachel and Nora were knocking at my door and inquiring if I were alive. I opened the door and they came in, Rachel badly frightened and Nora sprinkling holy water over the room. I hurriedly dressed and went up to my daughter's, Mrs. Winslow's house, 1945 Pacific Avenue, and found her and the children with their neighbors in the street and very much frightened. Their house was cracked considerably, and she had been imprisoned in her room by the binding of the door, which had to be broken open to enable her to escape. The chimneys of her house were thrown down, and much valuable glass and chinaware broken. I returned to my house, and found that the tops of all my chimneys had been thrown down, and one was lying in the front yard 16 feet from the building. There were some cracks visible in the library, but none in my room, and only very few in the parlor and dining room. In the kitchen, however, the plastering was very badly cracked, and the tiles around the sink thrown out. In the parlor the marble statue of the diving girl was thrown from its pedestal and broken into fragments. The glass case containing the table glassware in the dining room and its contents were uninjured. Very little china and glassware were broken in the pantry. The clocks were not stopped. A water pipe broke in the ceiling of the spare room, and the water did some damage. I then went over to the power house of the California Street Railroad, and found that about 70 feet of the smokestack had fallen diagonally across the roof, and about 6 feet of it into the stable, where there were 2 horses. Fortunately, it did not touch them, but before they were released they squealed and cried most piteously. One of them was so badly frightened that he was afterward useless, and we turned him out to pasture, and he grew lean and absolutely worthless. Things were considerably disturbed, but the engines were apparently uninjured. The watchman was not injured, although surrounded by falling bricks and mortar. I was told that the water supply was stopped, and later learned that it was because the earthquake had broken the water mains. I then started on foot downtown. This was about 7 a.m. No cars were running on any line. The sidewalks in many places were heaved up, chimneys thrown down, and walls cracked by the earthquake. St. Mary's Cathedral and Grace Church gave no outward sign of being injured, neither did the Fairmont Hotel. I went on California Street, over Nob Hill, and as I got in sight of the business part of the city, I saw as many as 10 or 12 fires in the lower part of the city. The wind was light from the northwest, and the smoke ascended in great columns, and the sun through it looked like a large copper disk. When I arrived at California and Montgomery Streets, the lower part of both sides of California Street seemed to be all on fire. I did not realize that the whole city would be burned. I had a vague idea that it would stop or be stopped, as fires had been hundreds of times before in this city. I went along Sansom Street to Pine, and down Pine towards Market. I saw that Holbrook, Merrill & Stetson's store was all on fire, and when I arrived at Front Street, I saw that the commercial block on the southeast corner of Front and California Streets, on the 5th floor of which was my office, was not on fire. So I started to go toward the building. The fire was then burning fiercely at the southeast corner of California and Battery. I went to the entrance at 123 California Street and met the janitor coming out, who said I could not go upstairs as the building was on fire on the 5th floor. However, I started slowly up. The sparks were coming down into the open area in a shower, but there was no smoke in the building, so I was sure that it was not on fire on the inside. I got up to my room on the 5th floor and found that the door would not come open. I tried the door in the adjoining office of the American Beet Sugar Company and found it open. From that room I got into mine. I raised my shades, and the fire was blazing at Battery Street in California, fully 75 feet high, and not more than 300 feet distant from me. I looked through the hall and rooms and saw no smoke, and was sure that I was safe for a few minutes. As I turned the combination of my safe to open it, another shock of earthquake came, which confused me a little, but I persevered and opened it. I had a quantity of souvenirs and presents which had been given me in years past. These I gathered up, and with my deeds and insurance and other papers, soon had my arms full. I saw a fish basket on my closet. I got down and put all these little things in it, then opened the little iron box in the corner of the safe, and there dropped out some coins on the floor. I remembered that I had put 4 $20 pieces in there the day before. I felt on the floor and picked up 2 of them, and as I did not find any more, I concluded that they must have remained in the safe. So I took the fish basket and my books and papers in my arms, closed the safe, turned on the combination, and started down the stairs to the street. The sparks were plentiful in the area when I went up, but they were more so as I came down. A perfect firestorm, after the manner of a snowstorm. When I got back on to California Street, the air was a mass of sparks and smoke being blown down the street toward the ferry. As I had to go against it to get to Front Street, I was afraid that my papers would take fire in my arms, so I buttoned up my coat to protect my papers, pulled my hat over my eyes, and dived through, up California Street and out front towards Pine Street, from where I started. There I found it clear of smoke and fire. As I passed along with my arms full, I saw a typewriter cover on the street, which I picked up. Finding it empty, I stopped and turned it over, and dropping my bundle into it, started for Front and Market Streets. There was no fire within a block of that corner at this time. This was about 8 a.m., perhaps 8:30. I sat down on an empty box in the middle of Market Street for a rest, when W. R. Whittier came along and helped me with my load. We took it to the door of the Union Trust Company, and they would not let me in. I went upstairs and found Mr. Deering, who took it, and we went down and put it into the vault between the outer and inner doors. In 22 days afterward I received it back, in as good condition as when I had left it there on the memorable 18th of April. I next went up to 3rd Street, and found the fire raging strong at the corner of 3rd and Mission. My son was passing in his automobile, and I got in with him. He was going to the Mechanics' Pavilion, where he said he could do some work for the temporary hospital established there. When we reached the pavilion, they said there were 200 wounded inside. At this hour there was no building on fire on the south line of Market Street, west of Fremont Street. We went around to the drug stores and hardware stores to get hot water bags and oil and alcohol stoves and surgeon's appliances. We took with us Miss Sarah Fry, a Salvation Army woman, who was energetic and enthusiastic. When we arrived at a drug store under the St. Nicholas, she jumped out and, finding the door locked, seized a chair and raising it above her head, smashed the glass doors in and helped herself to hot water bags, bandages, and everything which would be useful in an emergency hospital. I continued with Harry for a couple of hours. I then started down Market Street. The fire at that hour, 10:30 a.m., was raging strong south of Market Street, from about 5th to 10th Street. I left Market Street and went up onto Golden Gate Avenue. At Hyde and Golden Gate Avenue I saw a large 2-story house which had been wrecked by the earthquake. The doors, windows, and all the upright portion of the first story were crushed and stood on an angle of 45 degrees. I inquired of a woman seated on a pile of rubbish, who said, "No one was killed, but what am I to do?" The City Hall was badly wrecked. Great cracks were to be seen, and about 2/3 of the great dome had fallen. On one of our trips we went out to the Park Emergency Hospital, and at 11 o'clock I found myself in the Pacific Union Club, and was able to get a cup of coffee and a sandwich, which was the first food I had tasted that day. I went out from the club and saw the fire raging on Market Street between 1st and 2nd. About this hour a policeman notified me to meet the mayor at the Hall of Justice, who had called a meeting of citizens for 2 o'clock. Met Mr. J.E. Tucker, sat down with him on a box in the middle of Market Street, opposite Lotta's Fountain, and we discussed the situation. We agreed that the city was doomed to destruction, and that we were unable to do anything to save it. Crowds of people were about, only looking on. Some looked dazed, and others wildly excited. I walked down to Bush Street, between Sansom and Montgomery, met Mr. Murphy of the First National Bank, and Herman Ulrichs, and discussed with them as to whether it would come to his building. The earthquake had thrown the heavy granite cornice of his bank building into the middle of Bush Street. Murphy, Grant & Company's building was on fire at this time. This was between 1 and 2 p.m. Went along Montgomery to California Street, and found the fire approaching Montgomery Street. At 3 o'clock it had got to the Palace Hotel on the Mission Street side, and by 3:30 it was well on fire. About this time I went into the Western Union Telegraph Office, and while writing a telegram to Nellie and Robert, who were on their way to New York, the announcement was made that no more telegrams would be received. I then walked home, and at that time the streets leading to Lafayette Square and the Presidio were filled with people dragging trunks and valises along, trying to find a place of safety. They generally landed in the Presidio. As night came on, the fire made it as light as day, and I could read without other light in any part of my house. At 8 in the evening I went downtown to see the situation, going to Grant Avenue through Post Street, then to Sutter, and down Sutter to Montgomery. The fire was then burning the eastern half of the Occidental Hotel and the Postal Telegraph Company's office on Market Street, opposite 2nd Street, and other buildings adjoining. At this hour the fire was about 1.25 miles from my house. The Lick House and the Masonic Temple were not on fire then. I next went to Pine and DuPont Streets, and from that point could see that the Hall of Justice and all the buildings in that vicinity were on fire. Very few people were on the street. Goldberg, Bowen & Company were loading goods into wagons from their store on Sutter Street, between Grant Avenue and Kearny. I attempted to go in to speak to the salesman, with whom I was acquainted, but was harshly driven away by an officious policeman, as if I was endeavoring to steal something. I came back to my house at 9:30, and found in the library Mr. Wilcox and his mother, Mrs. Longstreet, Dr. and Mrs. Whitney, Mrs. Hicks and her daughter, Sally, Ruth, and Marie Louise. They were all very much alarmed, as the information which they obtained from the excited throng on the street was of the wildest kind. The two automobiles and the Wilcox carriage stayed in front of the house all night, at an expense of $25 per hour for the carriage. I felt tired and went to bed at 11 p.m. and slept until 2:30 a.m., got up and went downtown again to see what the situation was. I went to California Street, then to Hyde, then to Pine. From Pine and Leavenworth I could see that the fire was, at that hour, burning along O'Farrell from Jones to Mason and on the east side of Mason Street. The St. Francis Hotel was on fire. I went from Pine and Mason to the Fairmont Hotel at California and Mason. The hill is very steep between these streets, and many people, having exhausted themselves, were sleeping in the street on the paving stones and on mattresses. I did not think the fire would pass beyond the Fairmont Hotel, as there was hundreds of feet of space between the front or eastern side of the hotel and any other building. But the fire passed up beyond the hotel on Sacramento Street until it reached a point where the hotel was at the leeward of the flames. The hotel was not finished, and in the northeast corner were kept the varnishes and oils, which very much aided in the destruction of the building. From California and Mason Streets I could see that Old St. Mary's Church, on the corner of California and DuPont Streets, and Grace Cathedral, on the corner of California and Stockton, were on fire. To the north, Chinatown was in a whirlpool of fire. I returned home on California Street and Van Ness Avenue. Both streets were thronged with men, women, and children, some with bundles, packages, and baby carriages, but the usual method was to drag a trunk, which made a harsh scraping noise on the sidewalk. I overtook a man dragging a trunk with a valise on top, which kept frequently falling off. As I approached him, I took the valise in my hand, and with the other took hold of the rope and helped him drag the heavy trunk. As we were strangers, I am sure that he had first took me for a thief who intended to steal the valise. I at once entered into conversation with him, and from his manner later on, I think he changed his mind, for when I left him a few blocks away, he was hearty in his thanks. While passing the Knickerbocker Hotel on Van Ness Avenue, I saw a party of ladies and an elderly gentleman. They were very much excited, and were hesitating about returning to their homes for their personal effects. I stopped and assured them that they had plenty of time to go and return as many times as they wished, as the fire would not reach Van Ness Avenue for at least 5 hours. It did not reach there for 13 hours. I think I succeeded in quieting them, at least for a time. When I arrived at Sacramento Street and Van Ness Avenue, I saw a woman tugging at a trunk which had caught on the car track, and I helped her release it. From the speed at which the fire was traveling, I judged that it could not reach that spot in many hours. I advised her, as she was safe, not to overexert herself, but to take frequent rests. She would not take my advice, and I was obliged to leave her. The throng of moving people, men and women with babies and bird cages, and everything which they held most valuable on earth, began early Wednesday morning and continued until the afternoon of Thursday. Early Thursday morning, Mr. Wilcox, with his mother and sister, and Mrs. Hicks and daughter, left our house and were able to cross to Oakland, where they got a train for Los Angeles. Dr. and Mrs. Whitney went to a friend's house. Early in the morning, I went over to the California Street Power House and had a talk with Superintendent Harris. He said that he had run out 20 cars, but as the water was shut off and very low in the boilers, it was not safe to get up steam, and he was unable to get horses to haul away the cars, so nothing could be done but await the result, which was that every car in the house and those in the street, some of them 8 blocks away, 52 in number, were all burned. Not one was left. I came back to 1801 Van Ness Avenue. The wind was light, but was from the northwest. At 9 a.m. I sent in my son's automobile, my personal clothing, silverware, bedding, and linen to Mrs. Oxnard's, 2104 Broadway, and at 10:30 I had the rugs and some other things ready, and he took them to the Presidio. Matters about this time began to be rather wild. Van Ness Avenue was filled with people, all pale and earnest, everyone loaded with bundles and dragging valises or trunks. We concluded that it was best for Mrs. Winslow and the children to leave the city, so my son with his automobile took them to Burlingame. He had but little gasoline in his machine, and it was very doubtful if he had enough to make the run there and return. Not a drop could be obtained in the city. He learned that it might be obtained at the Washington Street Police Station, so applied for some, but could get none, and barely escaped the appropriation of his machine by the police, by saying that he was preparing to take out of the city a load of women and children, and starting up suddenly and getting out of their reach. So, with the children, Mrs. Winslow, and a few articles of apparel hastily gathered together, he, by a circuitous and zigzag route out of the city, made the trip and landed them safely in Burlingame at 4 o'clock. They could get no accommodation at the club, so they accepted the hospitality of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Coleman in a tent, and the next morning, Friday, went to Mr. and Mrs. Will Tevis's. Their kitchen chimney had not fallen, which made it possible to have cooking in the house, and as they had wells, the men put the pumps in order, so they had the luxury of a bath. When she left San Francisco, she expected her own house and mine would certainly be burned. So, with neither telephone, telegraph, nor mail, she passed many anxious hours until Monday the 23rd, when she heard that both houses were saved. At 11:30 a.m. of Thursday, from my window, I could see blazes on Jones Street at Clay and southerly as far as Sutter and Leavenworth. About this hour, although the fire did not reach here until after 3 o'clock, the soldiers and police drove the people from their stores and houses on Polk Street. Johnson and Company were ordered out and not permitted to return to save books and papers, although they begged permission to do so. I think the Pleasanton was on fire about this time. At noon the flames were continuous from Clay, on Jones, to California. At 1:30 it had almost reached Hyde and Clay, and was continuous from that point to Polk and Sutter, the blaze reaching from 50 to 75 feet high. At 2:30 it was approaching Van Ness at Hyde and Washington, and reaching south as far as Sutter and Van Ness. I was in my front room watching with my field glass house after house take fire, and the long line as I have just described. I saw many pigeons flying wildly about, seeking some place of safety. As it approached Van Ness, it did not burn north of Washington Street. The wind being northwest, and Van Ness Avenue 120 feet in width, I felt sure the fire would not cross. While the fire was thus raging, the thought came to me, how fast in value is property being consumed? And as I looked at the line of flame, I remember I thought it must be as much as $1 million an hour. It shows how imperfect in this matter was my estimate, when later the loss is estimated to be 400 millions, and the duration of the fire, from 5:15 a.m. the 18th to 3 p.m. of the 20th, say 60 hours, which would be at the rate of about 6,500,000 per hour. At 3 o'clock the soldiers drove the people north on Van Ness and west up to Franklin Street, saying that they were going to dynamite the east side of Van Ness. From my window I watched the movements of the firefighters and dynamiters. They first set fire to every house on the east side of Van Ness Avenue between Washington and Bush Streets, and by 3:30 nearly every one was on fire. Their method was this: a soldier would, with a vessel like a fruit dish in his hand, containing some inflammable stuff, enter the house, climb to the second floor, go to the front window, open it, pull down the shade and curtain, and set fire to the contents of his dish. In a short time the shades and curtain would be in a blaze. When the fire started slowly, they would throw bricks and stones up to the windows and break the glass to give it draught. It took about 20 minutes for a building to get well on fire. From 4 to 4:30, St. Luke's and the Presbyterian Church and all the houses on Van Ness Avenue from Bush to Washington were on fire. At about this time they began dynamiting. Then they started backfiring, and, as the line of fire was at Polk Street, the idea was to meet the flames and not allow them to cross Van Ness Avenue. This was a great mistake, as it caused the whole of the blocks between those streets to be on fire at once, which made an intense heat, while if allowed to approach Van Ness from Polk Street, the heat would have been much less, and would not have ignited the west side of Van Ness. The explosions of dynamite were felt fearfully in my house. Those within 2 blocks would jar and shake the house violently, breaking the windows, and at the same time setting off the burglar alarm. As the windows would break, it tore the shades and curtains, covered the floor with glass, and cracked the walls. After it was over, I found that it had demolished in my house 12 plates and 54 sheets of glass, each measuring about 30 by 50 inches. At 4:45 I was ordered out of my house by the soldiers, not in a quiet manner, but with an order that there was no mistaking in its terms and meaning, about like this: "Get out of this house." I replied, "But this is my house, and I have a right to stay here if I choose." "Get out damn quick, and make no talk about it either." So a soldier with a bayonet on his gun marched me up Clay Street to Gough, amid flames, smoke, and explosions. Feeling exhausted from climbing the steep street, and when within 100 feet of Gough Street, I rested on a doorstep. I had not been there for more than 2 minutes before a soldier on the opposite side of the street leveled his gun and cried out, "Get out of that, old man, and go on up to Gough Street." As he had a loaded gun, and appeared very important, I quickly obeyed his polite order. As I reluctantly ascended Clay Street in charge of the soldier, I held back long enough to see the steeple of the Presbyterian church fall. I stayed at Gough Street a while, looking down upon my house, expecting every minute to see the flames coming out of it. I watched from Gough Street with much anxiety, and made up my mind that I would see if I could not get back into my house, for I believed I could save it. The heat was so intense that it had driven the guards away from Van Ness Avenue, so, seeing no one near, I quietly slipped down the north side of Washington Street to Franklin. As no one was around there, I continued to Washington and Van Ness, and putting up my coat collar, and protecting the side of my face with my hat, I ran along Van Ness to my front door, and quickly got into the house again at 5:40, being kept out 55 minutes. My clothing got very hot, but was not scorched. This I did at a great risk of my life, for these soldiers were very arrogant and consequential at having a little brief authority, and I was afraid that they would not hesitate to shoot on slight provocation. I felt provoked and disgusted that I had to take such a risk to enter my own house. When I returned, Mr. Merrill's house had been dynamited, and the 2 churches, St. Luke's and the First Presbyterian, the Bradbury House at the corner of Van Ness and California Street, and the Knickerbocker Hotel adjoining, and the Gun House, corner of Clay and Franklin, had shared the same fate. On getting into my house again, I saw that the Neustatler House, at the corner of Sacramento and Van Ness, was half consumed, but it had not set on fire the Spreckels residence, and as at this time Mr. Merrill's house, which had been dynamited the second time, was so demolished, I felt that I could consider that my house had passed the critical time, for I hoped that Mr. Merrill's house, in burning, would not endanger the west side of Van Ness. But now a new danger threatened. The range of blocks from the north side of Washington Street to the south side of Jackson were on fire at Hyde Street, and the flames coming toward Van Ness Avenue, with the possibility of crossing. The Spreckels stable on Sacramento, and also the houses back of the Neustatler residence, were now on fire. This, I knew, would set fire to the 3 Gorevan cottages, 2 other 2-story houses, and the dynamited house of Mr. Gunn, all fronting on Clay Street, between Van Ness and Franklin. So I watched from my front window the fire approach Van Ness between Washington and Jackson, then going to my back window to see the threatened danger from Clay Street. The Wenban residence, at the corner of Jackson and Van Ness, was well on fire at 6:15. At 6:55 it fell in. The Clay Street danger began at about 7:30 p.m. At 8:15 the whole front, as here described, was blazing and at its full height. My windows were so hot that I could not bear my hand on them. I opened one and felt the woodwork, which was equally hot. I had buckets of water in the front and rear rooms, with an improvised swab, made by tying up a feather duster, ready to put out any small fire which would be within my reach. I watched the situation for an hour, and as the flames died down a little I had hope, and at 10 p.m. I felt satisfied that it would not cross Van Ness Avenue, and neither would it cross Clay Street. At this time, as the heat had somewhat subsided, I ventured out, and saw a small flame, about as large as my two hands, just starting on the tower of Mrs. Schwabacher's house, which is next to mine on Clay Street. A very few people were around. James Walton of the 28th Coast Artillery was there, also C.C. Jones of 2176 Fulton Street, and David Miller Ferguson of Oakland. I said I would give any man $10 who would go up and put out that fire. They went into the house with a can of water, climbed up the stairs and opened a window, and in a few minutes put it out. Two of the men would accept nothing. The soldier the next day accepted $10. I later presented Ferguson with a gold matchbox as a reminder of that eventful night. Had Mrs. Schwabacher's house gone, all in the block would have gone. The fire would have crossed to the north up Pacific, Broadway, and Vallejo, and probably over to Fillmore, when very little would have been left of the residence portion of the city. Now again another danger came. Another tier of blocks from Leavenworth to Van Ness, between Jackson and Pacific, had taken fire. This was about 10:15 p.m. At 11:15 it had got to Van Ness, and Bothan's house, which was at the corner of Van Ness and Jackson, was fully on fire. But although it was entirely consumed, the fire did not cross to the west side of Van Ness. The wind during all the day and evening was steady from the northwest, not a very strong wind, but it helped protect the west side of Van Ness. At 12 o'clock on the beginning of the 20th, I saw smoke coming out of the chimney of the Spreckels mansion. I went out and spoke to a fireman, and he said he had been into the house and that it was full of smoke and on fire. At 1 o'clock the house was on fire in the upper rooms, at 1:30 it was blazing out of the upper windows, and in a short time afterwards was wholly on fire. The fire caught the house from the rear windows by the blaze from the Gorevan cottages. I feel quite sure that if anyone had been on guard inside with a bucket of water, the fire could have been put out. When the Spreckels house was well on fire, I knew, from its having an iron frame, hollow tile partitions, and stone outside walls, there would be no danger from the heat to my house. As I was quite tired, I told the man Ferguson that I would go into my house and take a nap. He asked me what room I would sleep in, and he promised, if they were about to dynamite my house, or any other danger threatened, he would knock on my window to give me warning to get out. I went in and lay down on a lounge in the library at 2 a.m. and slept until 5 a.m. When I awoke and looked out, the flames were pouring from every window of the Spreckels mansion. At 10 a.m. the house was thoroughly burned out. The general appearance of the house from a distance is the same as formerly, the walls and roof remaining the same as before the fire. In the morning I went over to the California Street engine house and found it in ruins. Beams, pipes, iron columns, tie rods, car trucks, and a tangled mass of ironwork, all that was not consumed of 32 cars, bricks, mortar, ashes, and debris of every description, filled the place. The engine room was hot, but I crawled into it through what was left of the front stairway, which was nearly filled with loose bricks, and the stone facings of the Hyde Street front. It was a sad sight to me, for I had something to do with it from its earliest existence. The form of everything was there, but rods, cranks, beams, and pipes were bent and burned, whether beyond hope of restoration I could not tell. No one was there or on the street, and I came away with uncertain feelings. I had hope, but whether the loss would be total or partial I could not say. A further examination showed much damage. One shaft 14 inches in diameter was bent out of line 1 1/4 inches, one 8 inches in diameter, 7/8 of an inch, some of the large sheaves badly twisted. A new cable coiled on a reel ready for use was so badly burned in the portion exposed as to render the whole useless. As strange as it may seem, brass oilers and fillers on the engine frames were comparatively uninjured. The tank, encased in brick, contained 6,000 gallons of fuel oil, and with its contents was uninjured. The granite blocks on which the engines and drivers rested were badly scaled and cracked by the heat, and in some places entirely destroyed. The portions of the cables in use that were in the engine room were ruined, and on the street were burned off in 5 different places. The prospect of ever repairing and getting this machinery and appliances in operation again seemed impossible. It was, however, restored, and started up August 1st, 1906. At this time, about 8 a.m. Friday, I saw by the smoke that 3 large fires were burning at North Beach, in the direction of the Union Street engine house, from my house. I afterwards walked down into the business part of the city. The streets in many places were filled with debris. In some places on Kearny and Montgomery streets, to the depth of 4 feet in the middle of the street, and much greater depth on the sidewalk. The track and slot rail of the California Street Railroad were badly bent and twisted in many places. The pavement in numberless places was cracked and scaled. A very few people were to be seen at that time among the ruins, which added much to the general gloom of the situation. I found it then, and ever since, very difficult to locate myself when wandering in the ruins and in the rebuilt district, as all the old landmarks are gone, and the only guide often is a prominent ruin in the distance. As there were no cars running in the burnt district, I found my automobile very useful, although the rough streets, filled with all manner of debris, punctured the tires too frequently. The water supply in our house was gone, as was also the gas and electric light. The only light we could use was candlelight, and that only until 9 p.m. The city authorities issued an order that no fires could be built in any house until the chimneys were fully rebuilt and inspected by an officer. The water we used was brought by my son in a wash boiler in his automobile. He got it out near the park. People all cooked in improvised kitchens made in the street. As we were prohibited from making fires in the house, I improvised a kitchen on the street. I found some pieces of board, which were blown into the street, and partially covered with brick and stone, from St. Luke's Church, and with some portieres from the house constructed a rude shelter, and put a laundry stove in it, so we could make coffee, stew, and fry after a fashion. Some people set up a cooking stove, many set up 2 rows of bricks with a piece of sheet iron laid across. Our doorbell was rung several evenings, and we were ordered to put out that light. About noon on the 20th, the blocks between Pacific and Filbert were on fire at Jones Street, and the fire was again threatening Van Ness Avenue, but several engines were pumping, from one to another, salt water from Black Point, and had a stream on the west side of Van Ness until it was saved. While the fire was threatening, I went up to my daughter's, Mrs. Oxnard's, and told the servants to get things ready to take out. I would go back home, and if it crossed Van Ness I would return, but if I did not return in 15 minutes, they might consider the danger over. It did not cross. While this pumping was going on, and when the fire had approached the east side of Van Ness Avenue, one of the engines in the line suddenly stopped. This was a critical moment, but the firemen were equal to the emergency, and they uncoupled the engine which was playing on the houses, and remembering that the earthquake had disrupted and choked up the sewer, thereby damming up the outlet, and in fact creating a cistern, they put the suction down the manhole and continued playing on the fire, and saved the buildings on the north side. I tried to get the names of the foremen and the men who had the presence of mind and cool judgment, but was unable to do so. This ended the conflagration, but for 3 nights after there were fires from smoldering timbers and slow burning debris, sufficient to light up my room so that I could see to read. I was still in fear of a fire breaking out in the unburnt district west of Van Ness Avenue, and as there was no water in the pipes, we would be as helpless as ever. This gave much anxiety during the 2 weeks following the calamity. When night came on the evening of the 19th, the parks and the Presidio were filled with frightened people, old and young. Thousands left their homes in the, which afterwards proved to be, unburned district, and sought shelter, as stated, in the parks and streets in the open air. Mr. and Mrs. Dr. J. W. Keeney and family left their home at 2222 Clay Street, and remained on Lafayette Square in the open air for 2 days and nights with hundreds of others, who feared another earthquake and the conflagration. The afternoon after the fire had exhausted itself, the atmosphere was hot, the great beds of coal gave out heat and glowed brightly at night. The more I saw of this desolation, the worse it looked. I barricaded my windows the best I could with mattresses and rugs, as the wind was a little chilly. They stayed that way for about 2 weeks. The front of my house was blistered and blackened by the intense heat. The paint melted in a peculiar way, and over 2 of the windows it hung like drapery. This morning, Saturday the 21st, a man with a policeman came to the door and demanded blankets, coverlids, pillows, and mattresses. I gave all I could spare, and some draperies besides. They insisted on taking the rugs from the floor, and I had much difficulty in making them see that rugs were not what they needed. The telegraph and telephone wires made a network on every street, and for more than 2 weeks I carried in my pocket a pair of wire cutters, which I had often occasion to use. During the week following the fire, I found many water pipes leaking, and I went around with a hammer and wooden plugs and stopped them, in hope to raise the water sufficient to have a supply in my house. I think I succeeded. This morning, Saturday, I was hungry, with nothing in my house to eat. I found a fireman on the street who gave me one of 2 boxes of sardines which he had, and a stranger gave me soda crackers, so I had a pretty fair breakfast under the circumstances. Bread we were able to buy after a few days. On May 3rd we were able to buy the staple articles of food. Up to that time we obtained what we needed from the relief committee, such as canned meats, potatoes, coffee, crackers, etc. The city being under military rule, on May 4th I obtained the following orders: San Francisco, May 4th, 1906. To all civic and military authorities: permit the bearer, Mr. J.B. Stetson, to visit the premises, 123 California, and get safe. J.F. Dinan, Chief of Police, May 4th, 1906. Permit Mr. Stetson, number 123 California Street, to open safe and rem contents. J.M. Stafford, Major, 20th Infantry, USA. So, with this permit, authority, or protection, or whatever it may be called, I found my safe in the ruins, and everything in it that was inflammable burned to a coal. One of the $20 gold pieces before mentioned was saved. During the afternoon of the 18th and until 3:00 p.m. of the 19th, the scraping sound of dragging trunks on the sidewalks was continual. All sorts of methods for conveying valuables were resorted to: chairs on casters, baby carriages, wheelbarrows, but the trunk dragging was the most common. It was almost impossible to get a wagon of any kind. The object of the people was to get to the vacant lots at North Beach and to the Presidio grounds. Shortly after the calamity, the most absurd stories were in circulation. It was stated that a man came out of the wreck of the Palace Hotel with his pockets filled with human fingers and ears taken from the dead inmates for the rings and earrings. As no one was injured in the hotel, it was wholly imaginative. A man near the park met another who related the shocking occurrence of 2 men having been hanged on a tree in sight, and not a long way off. The man hastened to the spot and found no crowd nor men hanging. My son was engaged with his automobile all the forenoon, in work connected with the temporary hospital at the Mechanics' Pavilion. At about 11 a.m. it was found necessary to remove the patients, which was finished by noon. When the last one was taken out, he went in and made a search, and found that all had been taken away. Still, the report was believed by many that 100 or more perished there by the fire. A few personal experiences have come to me, and as I can verify them, I have here inserted them. One of our men, who roomed near the engine house on California Street, packed his trunk and dragged it downstairs, and started along the street for a place of safety until he came to a pile of brick, when he stopped and had just time to lay the brick all around it and run away. The next day, as soon as the heat would permit, he went for his trunk and found it slightly roasted, but the contents uninjured. A lady who does not wish her name mentioned relates a very interesting and thrilling story of her earthquake experience. She says she had permitted her servant to go away for the night, and at 5 o'clock she remembered that the milk can had not been placed out as usual, so at that hour she concluded to get up and do it herself. She did so, and before she could return to her bed, the shock came and the chimney was thrown over, falling on the roof and crashed through that and the ceiling of the chamber and on to the bed, which she had left only a few minutes before. Alfred Bowles, roadmaster of the California Street Cable Railroad Company, was working on the cables all of the previous night, and up to about 4:30 on the morning of the 18th. Therefore, that night at their home in the Richmond district, the daughter slept with her mother. The earthquake shook the chimney down, which fell through the roof and ceiling of her room, and covered the bed with brick and mortar. Had she been in it, she certainly would have been killed. Mr. and Mrs. Weatherly, who were living in the Savoy, carefully packed a trunk of their most valuable belongings, and he started up Post Street dragging the trunk, seeking a place of safety. The porter of the Savoy called him back, and showed him an express wagon in front of the house, and said he was about to start for Golden Gate Park, so he lifted his trunk onto the wagon. About this time a soldier or policeman came along and said, "I want these horses," and without ceremony unharnessed them and took them away. In a few minutes the fire had got so near that it was impossible to get other horses or move the wagon by hand, and the wagon and contents were burned. Mr. and Mrs. J. L. Tharp tell a very interesting story of their experience on that April morning. Their sleeping room was one fronting on the east side of Scott Street, between Sacramento and California Streets. When the shock came, it rolled their bed from one side of the room to the other, quite across the room, and where the bed had stood was filled with the broken chimneys, to the amount of more than 3 tons. Mrs. Tharp remembers having oiled the casters on the bedstead only a short time before, which she thinks saved their lives. Later in the day or the beginning of the next, while the fire was still miles away, some friendly but excited neighbors came rushing into Mr. Tharp's chambers, commanding him to flee, as the house was in danger from the conflagration. He was at that instant engaged in changing his undergarments, and had his arms and head nearly through. They shouted for him to come quick and save himself. He begged for a little more time, when one of them petulantly exclaimed, "Oh, let him burn up if he is so slow." The fire did not come within 2 miles of this place. Shortly after the fire, and as soon as people began to realize the extent of the calamity, I listened to many discussions and prophecies concerning the future in reference to business and rebuilding. It was the general opinion that the business of jewelry and other luxuries would be ruined for many years to come, that Fillmore Street and Van Ness Avenue would be only used temporarily, that the downtown district would be restored in 2 years. Many entertained opinions exactly the reverse, and predicted all sorts of gloomy outlooks. Many theories and predictions were made, none of which have been verified. My daughter, Mrs. Oxnard, with her husband, was on her way to New York. At about noon of the 18th they heard, at North Platte, that there had been a severe shock of earthquake in San Francisco, and that the lower part of the city south of Market Street was on fire. They thought the report exaggerated, and at first declined to give it much attention, but when they met friends at Grand Island at about 3 o'clock, they got information of such a character that it began to give them fear. At every place until they reached Chicago additional news was obtained, which indicated a very alarming condition of things here. They went to the offices of the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe Railroad companies, but could get nothing that they considered reliable. So they started on their way to New York from Chicago, in doubt as to whether they should continue or turn back. On arrival in New York on the 20th there was much excitement. Newspapers issued extras every hour, filled with fearful stories and of the progress of the fire. The limits of the burned districts were reported with great accuracy, but the stories were alarmingly exaggerated and in many instances absurd. One telegram read that the dead were so numerous that it was impossible to give burial, and the government at Washington was asked to furnish a ship that they might be carried out far into the ocean and thrown into the sea. Some were fortunate enough to get a telegram, which was eagerly read and discussed. The number of people killed was reported to be from 1 to 30,000. I finally received a telegram from them, asking whether I should advise them to return, which I answered at once to come by all means. So they started back, arriving here on the 4th of May. My sister was in Dresden, Germany, and was, like others, in an excited condition until she could hear by mail from San Francisco. She says the first knowledge of the disaster reaching her was from a small evening paper printed in English, which, in a very brief item, said that San Francisco was destroyed by an earthquake this morning, April 18th. This was all the information which she could obtain that afternoon and evening. A neighbor, a German lady, came in the next morning and told her that the German newspapers of that morning said that the city of San Francisco was on fire and that the loss of life was enormous. That day, the 19th, she visited the bulletin boards of the different newspapers, and with her daughter endeavored to translate the brief cable telegrams which were posted. The news came to London in English, and there cut down as brief as possible and translated into German, so the information was very brief. San Francisco people who were there sought one another for news. Within a week the New York papers came, which gave more particulars. While waiting for authentic information, such items as these were in circulation: Golden Gate Park has been withered by the intense heat, and the people are crowded to the beach, and that typhoid fever has broken out, that a tidal wave had swept over the city, that the earthquake shocks continued, that all communication with the interior by rail or otherwise had been cut off, that 30,000 people had been killed. Whether her family and friends were alive, she did not know. In this state of mind, she found in a New York paper a picture of the Spreckels residence, which showed mine. This was the first information that she received in reference to her family or their belongings. Mr. and Mrs. Dorman and his sister, Mrs. Paulson, of San Francisco, were in Dresden, and did much to allay the fears of the San Franciscans. During the first few days the German people got over the excitement, but not so with those whose homes were in this city. A letter, which I mailed to her on April 22d, reached her on May 8th, which was the first one she received, and which assured her of the safety of her family and friends. Charles Stetson Wheeler, Jr., who was in school at Belmont, sends me an interesting account of his experiences. He says: "I was awakened by the violent shaking of my bed, which rolled across the room and struck the one occupied by my roommate. The pictures and frames fell from the walls, the bowls and pitchers from the washstands, the books from the shelves, and all were scattered over the floor. A piece of plastering and a broken washbowl struck me on my head. I at first thought it was the playful prank of the boys, but having got out of my bed, I was thrown headlong on the floor. I knew it was something serious, and realized that it was an earthquake. I in some way got down the stairs, I hardly know how. In the yard I found my companions badly frightened, all in pajamas, gazing at the sagging walls, broken windows, and chimneys. My roommate, who had got out ahead of me, rushed up to me and cried out, 'By Jove, I'm glad you're out safe. I didn't think of you until I saw you zigzagging out of the building.' I thanked him and joined the crowd, watching one of the teachers, who was climbing the flagpole so as to be on top of the building if it further collapsed. We were all silent for a few minutes, but when the shock was fully over, we talked glibly and loud enough, and had many jokes. No fires were started as in San Francisco. We asked one another if this was the end of the world or only the beginning. 'Do you think we will get a holiday?' etc. As the excitement subsided, we began to shiver, so by common consent we sought in the ruins for our clothing. I felt that another shock might follow, and possibly worse than the first, and got out of the wrecked building as soon as possible. A little later I found the headmaster of the school. 'Good morning,' said I. 'Unfortunate morning,' he replied. 'Brick structures do not hold together when acted upon by conflicting motions caused by the vibrations due to earthquakes. This disturbance is purely local, and I think that Belmont is the only place which has suffered. I thought of our home in the city, which is built of brick, and that my mother, father, and sisters were in it. The more I thought of it, the weaker I felt, until my knees were shaking. In about 20 minutes I was at the Belmont station, determined to go to the city to learn the fate of my family. I tried to telephone, but I was told that both telephone and wire connections between San Francisco and Belmont were broken. This was the first proof that the earthquake was more than local, and my fears were heightened. As I waited, I was joined by other boys. All were curious to know what had happened in other places, but few were worried. Soon the entire school was gathered at the station. A teacher on a bicycle arrived and demanded, in the name of Mr. R., that we return to school. The majority complied, but 5 of us refused. We were promised expulsion. At last the train pulled in. We boarded it with difficulty, for it was packed with Stanford students. They told us that their college was a wreck. "The buildings are of stone, you know," said one, "and stone buildings can't stand up against an earthquake." Hearing remarks like this made me so dizzy with dread that I began picturing to myself the ruins of my home. I could almost hear the groans of those most dear to me buried under tons of stone and beams. It was maddening, and I had to struggle to keep from crying out like a child. Slowly the train pulled by the ruins of San Mateo, Burlingame, and Millbrae, but just outside of San Bruno the long line of straining cars came to a sudden halt. We climbed out to find the cause of the stop. Ahead, we saw several hundred yards of track buckled and humped like much crumpled ribbon. We had gone as far as possible by rail. We counted the money in the crowd, and decided to rent a rig if possible and drive the 20 miles to our homes. After walking 3 miles, we found no one willing to take us to the city for the money we were able to offer, so at this point 2 of our party left us. We must have gone about 8 miles when the van of the thousands leaving the city met us. They were principally hobos and riffraff, packing their blankets on their backs. We stopped and anxiously inquired the plight of the city. Some said that the city was burned to the ground, some that the whole town was submerged by a tidal wave, but all agreed in this particular, that it was time to leave the city, for soon there would be nothing left of it. The numbers of the retreat were increasing now. We could see mothers wheeling their babies in buggies, limping, dusty, and tired. Men lashed and swore at horses straining at loads of household furnishings. All were in desperate haste. This increased our speed in the opposite direction. We began to see the dense black cloud of smoke hanging above the skyline ahead of us. We almost ran. As we passed over each mile, we heard more distressing tales from those leaving. Men called us fools to be going toward the doomed town. Thousands were traveling away. We were the only ones going toward San Francisco. At last we came to the old Sutro Forest. We toiled up to the summit of the ridge and looked down, for the first time, upon the city we were raised in. In my mind it was a sight that shall always be vivid. The lower part of the city was a hell-like furnace. Even from that distance we could hear the roar of the flames and the crash of falling beams. We were paralyzed for a moment with the wonder of it. Then we began to run hard, down the slope toward the city. It was impossible for us to see our homes, for many hills intervened. Soon we reached the outskirts of the town. Fear grew stronger and stronger in my heart as I saw that all the chimneys of the houses were littering the streets through which we passed. They were of brick, and so was my father's house. The trip across the city seemed endless, even though we strained every effort to hurry. I had had no breakfast and was almost sick with fear and hunger. We passed a brick church, and it was in ruins, shaken to pieces by the shock. I almost reeled over when I saw it. The rest of the way I ran. As I came within 4 blocks of the house, I looked anxiously over the roofs of other houses for its high chimneys that had hitherto been visible from that point. I could not see them. Then I was sure that all was over, and that my father, mother, and sisters were lost forever. These last 4 blocks I fairly flew in spite of my fatigue. I kept my eyes on the ground, not daring to raise them as I ran. Then, as I reached the curb before the door I never expected to enter again, I looked up. The house, though shorn of its chimneys, stood staunch and strong. They were safe. For a second I stood still. Then, like a poor fool, I began to laugh and shout. That was the most joyous homecoming of my life. During the day of Wednesday, April 18th, I saw some of the damage done by the earthquake. The loss to California Street Cable Railroad was the upper portion of the chimney. I had my lunch at the Pacific Union Club, corner of Post and Stockton Streets, and noted that building was damaged but very little. Only some few pieces of plastering fell. The Call building gave no evidence on the outside. The commercial block, in which my office was located, did not show any damage. The door leading into my office would not open, but the next one did. My house shows a few cracks. The tops of the chimneys on my house were thrown off, and the kitchen chimney had to be rebuilt. But the great loss, the great calamity, was the fire. After that had raged for 3 days, the havoc was fearful to see. For miles and miles there was not a remnant of anything inflammable remaining. Nothing but brick, stone, broken crockery, iron and telegraph poles. In the general appearance it resembles the country where a forest fire has swept, the chimneys and unburned telephone poles representing the standing trunks of trees. The loss of life is probably nearly 450. Many earthquake shocks were felt during the 3 days of the calamity, and for as much as 2 months we felt gentle reminders. The soldiers lacked good sense and judgment, or perhaps it may have been that some incompetent officers gave senseless orders. For instance, the people occupying the stores on Polk Street between Clay and Pacific, and the apartments above, were driven out at 8 a.m. of Thursday and not permitted to re-enter. As the fire did not reach this locality until about 4 p.m., there was abundant time to save many valuable articles which were by this imbecile order lost. Why this was done, I did not at the time, nor have I since been able, to understand. Being busy in the work of restoration, I forget what a terrible calamity has befallen the city and the people, but I sometimes realize it, and it comes like a shock. It is estimated that 28,000 buildings were destroyed. I find that people lost the power of keeping time and dates, and if I had not made notes at the time, I would be unable to recollect the events of these 3 days with any degree of accuracy in point of time. I have felt that it was fortunate that this calamity did not happen on a Friday, or on the 13th of the month. Had it occurred on either of those days, superstitious people would have had much to aid them in their belief. The feeding of 300,000 people suddenly made destitute is a matter of great difficulty, but it has been done. It rained 2 nights, one night quite hard, but the health of the people has been remarkably good. We had water in the house on the 1st of May, glass in the windows on the 16th of May, gas on the 5th of June, electric light on the 7th of June, and cooked on the street until the 8th of May. June, 1906. End of San Francisco during the eventful days of April 1906. Read by Ciuffi Galeazzi, Rohnert Park, California.